Good morning, everybody. It's good to see everyone. We thank you for being here this morning. Put this to advance. There we go. So we were introduced to Abram in our last class. We studied the first 9 verses of Genesis chapter 12 on Wednesday night. So we're picking up from there with verse 10. And we're going to try our best to get through chapter 14 today. Just a little bit of review from Wednesday night's class. You got the call of Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldeans. He was told to get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house to a land that I will show you. This map here kind of shows the area that he traveled originally from Ur to Haran. He stays there until his father Terah dies, and then eventually he and Lot and Sarai leave from there and head down to the land of Canaan. Just as a reminder, this is our 4th Bible period. We've already gone through the creation, which Wayne taught separated over a little bit in January and February. We discussed the flood, the scattering of the people, and now we're to this time of patriarchs, which will carry us through the rest of the book of Genesis. We talked about 3 main promises given to Abram, and then we also talked about a few personal blessings that were given to him. So let's start with the 3 promises given to him. First one about the nation, Genesis 12 and verse 2, I will make you a great nation. Talked about, God moved him out of there because he wanted a distinct nation coming out of Abram. He didn't want it to be polluted or from other families and stuff that was around there. So he moves him to the area he wants him to. And we mentioned in Genesis 46 that as we get through and talk about the people going down to Egypt, and by the time they come out of Egypt, before they take the land, they're told there that they're going to be a great nation coming out of Egypt. And that's stories to come later in the book. Then we talked about the seed promise, which is a spiritual blessing. We went back and tied what Wayne was teaching in Genesis chapter 3:15, which says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. We know that that's talking about Jesus, but we're tying that into what was discussed early in Genesis to what's told to Abram in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, where it says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This isn't going to be something, as we know, the Israelites that are coming later, it's not going to be something for just them. It's going to be something for all nations, and that seed would be Jesus. We talked about the land promise in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, and then specifically shown to Abram in verse 7. It says, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And he tells him to look and see it. And these promises will be repeated in the lesson today as well. Joshua 21 and verse 43, so the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. And then, as we mentioned, we talked about some personal blessings given in Genesis chapter 2 as well. Abraham would be blessed materially and spiritually. It says in verse 2, I will bless you specifically, and that his name would be exalted. Also in verse 2, I will make your name great, God tells him. And then also, and we'll see this kind of coming into the story here, and really several stories as we discuss Abram, and when he changed the name to Abraham, that men would be blessed or cursed based on their dealings with him. That was a blessing to Abram there, given in verse 3. Then we talked about him actually, so he had gone from the Ur of the Chaldeans, and then he traveled to Haran with his father Terah, and eventually after his father dies, they arrive in Canaan. That was discussed in 12 verses 4 through 7. He is 75 years old. It says they take all of their possessions. It says also that they take all of the people that they acquired, talking about servants and others, so they're growing as they are leaving there. They arrive in Canaan. It says he stopped at Shechem. He receives the land promise that we were talking about in verse 7 there. he builds an altar to the Lord, and this is something we see over and over with Abram that shows his great faith. He's constantly seeking God's counsel and worshiping him. But it says there in verse 7 that he builds an altar there. Then it says he travels to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitches his tent between Bethel and Ai. And in verse 8, again, he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So we're learning something about him here, that how much he loves for God and how he takes the time to show honor and respect for God. It says after that, kind of where we end on that he moves on to the south, it says, which is called the Negev or Negeb. And see if I can have all this in my next couple of maps. That's kind of the path that he took there. But what we just talked about, pitching his tent between Bethel and Ai, you can see on the slide up there, where that's blown up. It says, Bethel on the west, Ai on the east. Then after that, as we just read, how he heads down to the Negev or Negeb, going down to the south. And that gets us into our story today, which is actually going further south and going into Egypt. So today we'll try to talk about that a little bit, and also talk about more of the stories that have to do with Abram and his nephew Lot. So we'll read this in just a moment, but what's going to end up pushing him down into Egypt is when he's dwelling there or going through the south, there becomes a severe famine, and so he is trying to escape the conditions where he is to move on there. So let's get started and read. If you want to follow along, it's up on the board. If you want to use your own Bible or whatever, if you see it better, that's fine. But we're starting in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 10. It says, "Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, 'Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen, when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live.'" Continue with verse 13. "Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, that I may live because of you." So it was, when Abram came into Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Verse 17, "But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, 'What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way.' So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had." So let's get into some of the details there, but I can just tell you from past history, I just wanted to say, I can remember being in some Bible classes when I was a little bit younger, and some of this got a little bit contentious, a little bit about people's opinions on this scripture right here, but let's look at the facts that are given, that are stated in this story right here, and then as we get through the comments here, if anybody has a comment on this, I'll give you time to discuss that at the time. So Abraham is kind of talking with Sarah, his wife, and bringing up that she is beautiful and that he fears he would be killed from the Egyptians who would want to take her from him. And then down in verse 13, he asks Sarah to deceive them by saying, "You are my sister, that I may live." And so the point comes up here, did Abram lie? Is this a half-truth? Is it half a lie? Is there such a thing? Well, half-truth is not the truth, is what I think we ought to get from this. Now, something you wouldn't necessarily know from this story that you know later is that one of his comments that he makes here did have truth to it. That's kind of why we put that in there about a half-truth right there, because we know in another story that strangely is very reminiscent to this exactly. This is dealing with a Pharaoh. We're going to see in about, 7, 8 chapters in the future as recorded, this very similar story happens with King Abimelech at a later time. Very identical, but we pick up a few facts from there, which is where this verse comes through, that we find out that she is or was his half-sister at the time. He's explaining himself in this other story. This obviously isn't from here, Genesis 20, verse 12. But indeed she is truly my sister. She's the daughter of my father, not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So entering Egypt, the question is, was she Abraham's sister at this point or wife? The relationship with Sarai had changed before entering Egypt. She was now Abram's wife. I believe this is what we're supposed to get out of this part of this right here, is that this is Abram's wife, and he's fearful of what's going to happen to him, and so he asked her to say that. So that leads us to some questions that maybe we can get some lessons about this, but just from the story itself, was Abram justified? Just read the verse from Genesis chapter 20, correct? We just read that. He said this is my sister. He's trying to defend what he had told them. This was my sister. And then he, no doubt there was at least a perceived risk of death. And when I say perceived risk of death, I'm relating this back to that he had received these promises from God. And I don't understand everything. I'm not trying to berate one of the greatest men of faith in the Bible, but it seems like he kind of lost focus a little bit. Maybe, and we can look that like we would. God had given him all these promises that's going to, come through him. But as men do sometimes, fear overcomes what we may know. It's just too much in the moment sometimes to deal with. So he has a perceived risk of death, although we can look back now. It's easy to look back, but we can look back now and say there wasn't a safer man on the planet. And Abram couldn't really see that at the time. He's fearing as he's entering this country, they're going to want my wife who's beautiful, but he's afraid that they're going to kill him, although he should have seen really that God was going to take care of him. And, between the story we have today and when we get to this a little bit later in this story of Abimelech in chapter 20, you're going to see, and it kind of ties into that blessing that God told Abram. Remember, we talked about blessings and cursings of how people deal with Abram, but he kind of loses sight of that a little bit just in the fear of the moment that what's taking place at the time. So obviously this answer here, is lying ever justified? We know that answer is no. So then it leads to, when we're talking about ourselves, what would lead us to do some of these things sometimes? Abram was a great man of faith, but he's not perfect. When do we get caught up sometimes and stuff and don't say things that we should, and we deceive or lie? And I came up with some, and maybe if you have some comments, you can think of some others right here, but sometimes, and it's easy to see this maybe dealing with your children, but fear of consequences sometimes makes us, twist or change the truth around to fit our benefit, because we don't want to deal with the repercussions of what speaking the truth would get us. And that shouldn't happen, but with mankind, that is what happens a lot. And then also sometimes falsely trying to build ourselves up to other people. You start saying stuff that's not true about yourself just so people will look at you higher than what you are, and you lack humility and you do those sort of things. So from my studies in this right here, Abram actually made multiple mistakes in this story right here. He didn't put faith in God to preserve his life. What about those promises God made to him? Did he just in the moment forget all these? It seems like he did. He asked Sarai to lie or to deceive to protect him, asking her to make them think that he was sister and not wife. And then he endangered her and her life, her morals, all that by allowing her to be given to Pharaoh right there, to let somebody else take them as their wife. And then also, as you have the Pharaoh accusing him, why'd you do all this to me? He pretty much accusing him of lying and deceiving him, trying to portray this woman as his sister when it was his wife. So like to bring up the point again, Abram was not perfect. It's one of the main focuses in the entire Bible of a man of faith that put, so much of himself into whatever God told him to do. I mean, there may not be a greater example of faith that was man that lived on this earth other than talking about Jesus than Abram and Abraham himself. But sometimes he made bad decisions. He's not the only one. We just talked about Noah and him getting drunk. We talked about that right there. We talked about Adam and Eve in the garden. Mankind's not perfect, but this person was very close to God and cared a lot about God, but that didn't mean that he never made a mistake. And I feel like we can learn from that story right there that we need to learn from the way he handled a situation and know that we shouldn't handle any situation that's similar to that in the way that he did, so that we'll be pleasing to God in that right there. So just finishing up the story, and then I'll stop to take some comments. Sarah's taken to her after this happens, and Abraham's given all these things for her, but it was a bad trade. This was his wife. This was his wife. And, he gets all this right here, and obviously it wasn't what should have happened. The Lord's not happy, but remember the blessings and the curses. This is somebody Abram's dealing with, and God is going to curse the one that doesn't treat Abram or his family right. And so God severely plagues, may say great plagues right there, but severe plagues or great plagues he puts on Pharaoh and his house. We're not told the level of detail here that we're told in the story that we'll get into chapter 20, where God actually talks to the king in that story and tells him, you pretty much are a dead man walking. But we only know what we know. Did God say anything to him? Nothing's recorded here about it. Is it through the plagues themselves that he realizes it? We don't know. But finishing up the story there, Pharaoh learns the truth about Sarai as described down in verses 17 and forward. And, he just almost can't believe it. This deception. He's like, what have you done to me? Talking to Abram. Why did you not tell me she is your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? He's pretty much telling him, you didn't tell me the truth. You led me to destruction for no reason. I don't understand why you did that. So he says, take her and go your way. And then they are sent away, and that kind of ends that story here. But I wanted us to recognize right here, regardless of what happened in other things, God had a plan for Abram, and Pharaoh wasn't going to win. Pharaoh wasn't going to get to keep her as wife. Pharaoh wasn't going to get to kill Abram. God had a plan for him. So no matter how dire this situation might have looked to Abram, or how in control or powerful Pharaoh might have been feeling when he was taking her as his wife, we need to remember God is in control, not man. And then just the point that Abram and Sarah's lives are preserved. I kind of brought that up to be like that was one of the things that Abram was fearful about. I'm going to be killed. But God preserves their lives, and also his wealth is preserved. He wasn't wiped out from this situation. Remember those promises in Genesis that were specifically to him. God was going to bless him and make his name great also. Okay, before we get into chapter 13, who would like to make a comment or ask a question off of that story right there? Does anybody have a question or comment at all about the story that we just read? Scott?
Comments to the wife about how she's to adorn herself, that she's not to put emphasis on the external, but on the internal, her submissiveness and her character. And tie that in with the fact that Sarah is still noted to be a beautiful woman. So I think sometimes people take 2 Peter 3 and they take it to such an extreme that she's to do nothing to help make herself pretty. And I don't think that's the point, and I think that the fact that Sarah was still judged to be a beautiful woman helps us to understand 1 Peter 3. I hope that makes sense. But Well, it helps us
Women
understand.
can be beautiful, but the focus needs to be on the godliness.
Right, but the godliness doesn't exclude the fact that she can do things to make herself pretty. Just, we understand from this passage, and plenty of passages that she's not to go too far with that and make herself a show, but it doesn't mean that she can't do some things that would make herself attractive. At least that's what I take for that when I tie that in with the fact that and Sarah is my greater point, I guess. Sarah is she's mentioned as an example of one in 1 Peter 3 who is a example of her submission and her godliness in this context. She's cited it. Here's look at what Sarah was. And if you tie all that together, I think you can help. It helps us understand the real intent of 1 Peter 3. I hope I'm making sense. Maybe not.
Other comments?
Yeah. A bit about Abraham being accepted. One important thing, every major God character has that from Adam and Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, and that line. Then of course their faults, and it takes men like Abraham out of the realm of legend. They're real people, they're real humans, and they have struggled. We have struggled with it. It makes that all the real.
I agree. And that's one of the main things I want us to get out of this story when we talk about that kind of underlying theme that Wayne set up for this class, which was for us to be in all these stories that we think about the family unit and the faith that they showed, or the failings that they showed it by their actions right there, and what we can learn from that. They're not just stories, these are examples that we can learn from. All right, anybody else? Brent?
The Bible makes a statement that someone was a man of faith, or that say Noah walked with God. That would be a general statement. We would understand about their lives. It would not mean that they were walking with God even as they sinned. So when we see something that the Bible shows is wrong, at that point, that man is moving on. Over all his life, he may not say, walk with God, or be a man of faith. But when we sin, we sin.
Very good point. Brent's just bringing up the point that sin is sin. It doesn't matter if it's Abram or Abraham, or whether it's us. Sin is sin. And when man sins, he needs to make it right, own up for it. Any other comments? Okay, let's move on to chapter 13. So now we have Abram leaving there, kind of forced out of there, out of Egypt right there based on what just happened. We're told in the first verse of chapter 13, then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. So if you think about he's in Egypt in this area, I have some maps of this, but he's heading north to go to the south. So south we'd already talked about, it's south down there, the land of Canaan, that area called the Negev or the Negeb. So he's kind of heading back in that direction. All right, verses 2 through 4 says, Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Focus on that again. Constant calling on the name of the Lord. This map here kind of shows that. You see the red arrow in the bottom of the screen coming up there out of Egypt, heading back towards Canaan, back to Bethel. See where it's pointing to Bethel right there. I'll have the other map in there that kind of shows you. If you blow that up, remember where he had pitched his tent was Bethel was actually on one side and Ai was on the other. Here's that map right there. If you're looking about the center of the screen, kind of where the blue arrows come together. So continuing on there, verse 2, or breaking down what was said in verse 2. Recall, Abram would be blessed, going back to Genesis 12:2, where God says, I will bless you. Recall, he would be blessed by God material and spiritually. And it talks about, at this point, he's very rich. He's also very faithful to God. So here's an example of somebody that's got a lot of material possessions, but he's also rich spiritually. He worshiped God wherever he went. Verse 7, verse 8 of chapter 12, also there in verse 4, building altars to God, worshiping God, calling on the name of the Lord. Some of the questions Wayne had in here when he taught that he wanted us to think about when we're talking here, just talking about how rich Abram was, but being a spiritually strong fellow with a heart tied to God. Are the faithful always rich? Is that a true statement? Are the faithful always rich? Depends on how you're looking at it, I guess. And are the rich always faithful? So you flip that around, it can have very different meanings. In one way, is take somebody in our day and age, somebody that's a faithful Christian, are they always rich? Materially, we know that's not the case. Many times, yes, but in a lot of cases, no. Spiritually, they ought to be. They ought to be. And then, are the rich, material rich, always faithful? And we know that that's actually, in most cases, very seldom. Although in our country, as we've said many times before, most of us are considered to be rich. We may not be the richest of this country, but compared to most people in the world, we're considered rich. But are the rich always faithful? Just some thought questions. Put in a verse, and they're talking about the subject from Luke chapter 18, verse 25. For it is easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Sounds impossible, we know, but with God, anything is possible, but it sounds kind of impossible when you read that. But you got an example of somebody here given to us that had great possessions and loved God, and God loved him. Abram's rich material and spiritually because he submits to God and honors him. That's what we ought to know from that right there. Not be focused on the material, whether you have it or don't have it, but be focused on God. And Abraham was not perfect, as we've already discussed. Great example of faith. One of the greatest examples of faith. But he wasn't perfect, but he was persistent in his faith. Keep looking at all these examples, building the altars, worshiping God. And then down in verses 5 through 7, won't read those verses, we'll just kind of outline some of it. It's talking about Abram and Lot, and they're not going to be able to dwell any longer together. They're just kind of getting too big for where they're dwelling to be intermingled in the same spot. It says their possessions had become too great, verse 6. They had numerous servants, herds, flocks, and strife had started between their herdsmen. So the ones that their servants that are taking care of the animals, everything, they're starting to get aggravated with each other with the lack of space between them. And also just a note, in the land where they're at this time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites had already occupied a considerable part of this land. So it's not like it was all open to move to any spot they wanted at that time. There's people in the land. And then down in verses 8 through 9, here's another very good example of Abram as we see in the next several verses. He doesn't want strife between him and Lot or their herdsmen. He doesn't want there to be some conflict over what ought to be an issue that can be managed. He tells Lot, please separate from me. If you take the left, then I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, then I'll go to the left. That's down in verse 9 of chapter 13. And I put this next comment in green from verse 8, something we definitely can learn in today's time when we're having some sort of conflict that we ought to, how we ought to resolve it with each other. He says, because we are brethren. That's an important thing that he's saying right there. We're family. We ought to love each other and not let, strife enter us over something like, the herdsmen in our possessions being around each other. So he is one that keeps the peace. He's one that let others choose first, in this case with Lot. So this is something that we can definitely apply to ourselves today. Do we try to keep the peace with our brethren? I'm not talking about over a case of sin and letting something slide. I'm talking about these just conflicts of opinion that happen sometimes. Do we try to keep the peace? Do we let others choose or go first? Again, you can go back to kids, but to be honest, this happens with adults all the time. You see fist fights breaking out in a parking lot because that's my spot. and I was here a half a second before you, and those sort of things. We just take a deep breath sometimes. We can avoid conflict on unnecessary issues. So let's think about that. As the patriarch or head of the family, Abram might have chosen his own portion first and appointed Lot his, but intent upon peace. So that's his goal, because he's intent upon peace and feeling pure and parental affection for his nephew. He permitted Lot to choose first. So now let's get into Lot's poor choice and what maybe he could have done about it, but at this time it is what it is, but it leads him to a lot of trouble. Genesis 13, verses 10 through 13 says, "And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar." So he looked a certain way, water everywhere. It's like, oh, that looks beautiful. That looks great for where I need to be. Verse 11, "Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other." Verse 12, "Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent, even as far as Sodom." And of course, we already know this story, but big focus on verse 13 here. "But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord." So that ought to stop and make us pause right there. But Lot chose with his eyes. We got a picture here showing he looked down and he's like, grain, water. The animals are going to love it. This is going to be absolutely the best for me in my situation. And he's, as it says, he chose with his eyes. And it kind of shows in that little orange arrow at the top of the screen there as you're looking at it, kind of him heading down there towards the water. So he certainly should have left the choice to Abram and have been guided by him, but he took his own way, trusting his own judgment, and guided only by the sight of his eyes. So he chose the land without considering the character of the inhabitants. And again, I know we know these stories, but we make some of these decisions quickly. He didn't consider who was down there or what peoples were down there or how it may affect him. So this choice, as we shall see in the next few chapters, had severe consequences for his family. We know this already by knowing the story. We know what's going to happen. He didn't really know at the time, but it was all based on just looking, not discussing, not should I go see who's down there? Is this going to be right for my family other than the water, which is great? But what else is going to happen to me if I go there? Okay, and then verse 14, "And the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever." So again, that's going back. We got a promise repeated here of the land that he's going to get. Reference back to what we already studied last week, Genesis 12, 1 and 7. It's being repeated here. Now he's saying it again, in all directions, look, I'm giving this to you. And down in verse 16, he goes forward. Now he repeats the nation promise. "And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered." Reference back to Genesis 12, verse 2 there. So the promises were repeated into there. Then it says, "Abraham moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar to the Lord there." So we have him again as he's moving about, worshiping God, focused on his relationship with the Lord. "This land was given to Abram that it might descend to his posterity. And though Abraham himself cannot be said to have possessed it," if you'll read more about the story in Acts chapter 7, that's where it's talking about that. "Yet it was the gift of God to him on behalf of his descendants. And this was always the design of God, not that Abraham himself should possess it, but that his descendants would." So again, we know the story, but Abram, remember we had said last week that he was looking more towards heaven and to pleasing God, and not so much focusing on the physical and the earth. He could see the bigger picture. Didn't see it totally, but he could see the bigger picture. Okay, from chapter 13, are there any comments or questions that you want to bring up from the separation or from the choice of Lot choosing on his eyes, or maybe something we left out that could add a little clarity to that story? Any comments or questions? Okay, let's move on to chapter 14. Won't get very far on this right here. I'll have to finish this up next time. But in Genesis chapter 14, in short, there's 4 kings that are from Mesopotamia that are oppressing 5 kings that are from the lands around the Salt Sea. Their names are given there. We're told in verse 4 of chapter 14 that the 5 Canaanite kings had been subdued by Chedorlaomer and were obliged to pay him tribute, and that they had been doing that for 12 years, and in the 13th year of that, they revolt. The following year, it says that this Chedorlaomer invaded Canaan. He starts attacking multiple cities, and then you go down, and the 5 kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and those other cities listed there join the battle in the valley of Sodom, it says, which is the valley of the Salt Sea. You got 4 kings versus 5, the 4 Mesopotamian kings versus these 5 kings from these areas around the Salt Sea. It says the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Many died. It talks about the tar pits in that region. Some fell at that location, and others fled to the mountains down in verse 10. The 4 Mesopotamian kings win the battle, plunder Sodom and Gomorrah, and go their way, it says in verse 11. However, they made a big mistake here by taking captive Abram's nephew Lot. So Lot's captured, getting down to about verse 12. They took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So these kings take him off from there. An escapee from that battle finds Abram in Mamre and tells him that Lot is captured down in verse 13. And then it says that Abram takes 318. Wayne was just talking to me before class about this again. It's kind of amazing that he had 318. He'd kind of built his own army in this time, and he has 318 trained servants that he's going to take to go rescue Lot in verse 14. And he heads up towards Dan. There's some discussion about which Dan that is, but he heads way up north towards Dan, and he divides his forces, attacks the people by night. He pursues them all the way to a place called Hobah, which is north of Damascus. And then it says in verse 16, he brought back all the goods and brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. So what we can get out of this is, wow, you got a very brave individual here. And he's going to make sure that his family's protected. Somebody comes and tells him. Other people may have panicked and like, oh, there's nothing we can do, and be very sad about it. He takes action, which is how we know that's the kind of person Abram is. He's an action taker, and he goes up there and he gets Lot back and all his possessions. And you can see, just kind of looking at the map there, kind of where he chases them all the way through the land of Canaan and all the way up towards Damascus. So just amazing. He was going to make sure he got Lot back. And I'm going to stop there because not only did the bell ring, but there's no way I can really get into this other than I could squeeze out just reading the verses real quick and skip it. But we'll start with chapter 14, verses 18, and talk about Abram meeting Melchizedek, which we aren't told a whole lot about. Told a little bit about in the New Testament, we know, but in this story we're not told a whole lot about him, but pretty amazing story nonetheless. I don't want to skip it, so we'll talk about starting with Abram meeting Melchizedek. So reread that if you like, and then also read chapters 15 through 17 if you want to kind of get a look ahead and have some thoughts going in your own mind at where we're going in the next class. It is no class Wednesday, so the next class will be a week from today on Sunday morning because it's a singing night this Wednesday. Appreciate everyone's attentions and those that made comments, and thank you.